Welcome back, everyone. In this video, we are going to talk about how we can bring Redux into our application and how we actually convert these concepts that we learned about Redux into our code base and the patterns that will emerge. In order for us to use the Redux library inside of React, we need to install two libraries, and then I'm going to install an additional one that will help us understand the flow of these actions inside of our data. So the first library that I want to add is the Redux library. So this allows us to interact with the reducers that produce the root reducer, which produce the store. Then there is React Redux, which gives us all the React bindings so that we can dispatch and pull these store values off of Redux. And then there's Redux Logger, which is a great little tool that helps us understand how actions are firing and what's happening with our state. So you don't really need Redux Logger. That's the additional one that I mentioned. I always like to install it because I like to see what's happening with my store, and I'm very used to using that service. But once we have these three libraries, what we want to think about inside of our application is what Redux replaces. So as I mentioned, most of the time, you do not want to use Context API and Redux at the same time. The reason is because what our user context stores can be stored by Redux, and it's confusing to think about where all of your information and state is being stored. The reason for this is because in Redux, there's this concept of a single source of truth, which means that all of your state should be stored in one place. Generally speaking, this is your Redux store. So if you have user data stored in a context as well as Redux, then that gets really confusing as to what goes where. And you have to manage more dependencies of where your state lives. So what we want to do is we want to replace this user context completely with Redux. Now, in this video, what we're going to do is set up the basic Redux into our application, which does involve quite a few steps. And one of the known things about Redux is the boilerplate code that we have to write in order to get this code working. But it is an unfortunate side effect of this. I do want you to follow along because it is very key that we set it up this way. And I'll discuss why we're doing it this way as we go. But I do want to pre-warn you that there will be a lot of steps that we're going through. So please bear with me while we do this. The first thing that we want to do is we want to set up a store folder. This store folder is going to contain all of our Redux code. Inside of our store folder, we need to create a file, which is our store.js. This store is what I mentioned earlier as this almost combined place where all of our Redux happens. So where our state lives, but also where we receive actions and we dispatch them into our reducers to update the state. You need this store file because inside is where we're going to generate the store object that we will use inside of our React application. In order to do this, we actually need to import in three different methods from Redux, the core Redux library. We want to import compose, we want to import create store, and we want to import apply middleware. I'll talk about these three as we go through this. What we also want to import in is logger from Redux Logger. And again, I'm going to explain these concepts once we start getting to this portion. Every store, in order for it to work, needs reducers, as I mentioned. These reducers are what allow us to actually form the state object. So what we know is that we need something called a root reducer, if you remember. I mentioned that a root reducer is the combination of all of our reducers. It's kind of like one big reducer, if you want to think about your state being composed of multiple reducers. But we know that we need this in order for our store to have any kind of state value. Now, in order for us to build our root reducer, we are going to create a new file for this reducer, just so that we can separate out this concept. I'm going to call it rootreducer.js. Inside of here, I need to bring in a combine reducers method from Redux. And combine reducers is just a method that allows us to create a final big reducer that we can use inside of our store by combining smaller reducers together. And it's really just something that looks like an object. And to do that, what I'm going to say is that export const root reducer, so this is essentially the root reducer that we're creating, is equal to combine reducers. And then what we're going to pass into this parameter of combine reducer is an object where the keys and the values are going to be the name of the reducer slice and then the actual reducer function itself. So here it's a lot of boilerplate, as I mentioned, but each of these steps is crucial to understanding how it all fits together. I'm going to go over this all again as we build out our store. Don't worry. Right now, we just have to set up some things in order for this to work. So as I mentioned, we need a reducer, and we're replacing our user context. So what I want to create is a user folder inside of this user store, and inside I'm making a user.reducer.js file. This user reducer is going to literally be our reducer. So what we can do is we can actually take a lot of this reducer code that we have used inside of our context. All of this is actually the exact same. So this is one of the huge benefits we get from having already learned how reducers work inside of our code base. Because with this, I can pretty much now just start using our reducer, but we have to make a couple tweaks according to how the Redux structure is different. So the first thing is that by default, because we no longer have the hook use reducer, if you remember what happened here was that we passed initial state to use reducer. So the reducer knew that the first state is going to be this initial state value. Because we don't have that hook anymore, we need to give state inside of the function a default value, which will be initial state. So if nothing gets passed, then use the initial state. And the only time where state is not getting passed is when it runs for the first time. Because when your reducer initializes, of course, there's no state value. So giving it this initial state will allow us to know what the state value is. The other thing that's different is that all of our reducers react to every single action. As I mentioned with the user context, this previous user context used use reducer, and this use reducer returns you a dispatch. This dispatch, when called, will only fire actions to the associated use reducer that we got this from. So what did we get our use reducer from? User reducer. So any action you dispatch from this dispatch function you get back is going to dispatch the action only to this reducer. The same is going to be true for the cart context. As we know here, when we created our use reducer from our cart reducer, this dispatch will only dispatch to the cart reducer. It won't dispatch to the user reducer. This is where it's different because every single reducer receives every single action inside of Redux. So as a result, by default, whenever we don't respond to an action, because it's very possible, we might get actions where the type has nothing to do with our user reducer. It only has to do with our cart. If that happens, all of our cases, of course, are not going to switch. So then by default, we need to return back the current state. Only by returning current state does our code know, oh, okay, this part of my reducer did not change. Because as I mentioned, state is an object. Everything in React is referenced by memory. So because state is an object and it's the exact same previous object in memory, this reducer does not need to update. And this is going to be important when it comes to our re-renders, which again, you've probably heard me talk about numerous times. We're going to understand that once we start working with this reducer. So I'm going to export this out so that we can import in this user reducer into our root reducer. So I'm going to say import user reducer from user.reducer. And then using user reducer, I'm going to say, okay, inside of congruent reducers, we're passing an object. I want the key to be equal to user, and I want the value to be the user reducer. And now our actual final state shape is going to be this object where it's got user and then the actual state of the user reducer. So as we add more to our root reducer, this is how it'll grow. Now, just to go over what we learned as far as the differences in reducers go. Our reducers in Redux receive every single action that gets dispatched ever. And also we need to, as a result, return the default state. That is one thing you need to remember when migrating your existing reducers over from context into Redux. But also, this is one thing to know about Redux reducers and how reducers work in the Redux flow of data as a whole. Key thing, actions pass to every single reducer. So that means that every single reducer by default needs to return the previous state if none of the cases match to the type. So that's what we need to know about reducers inside of Redux, as well as composing our root reducer. In the next video, let's continue building out our store.